I read it a long time ago. It's fascinating. I think one of the things that Dahlia does uniquely well is apply the sort of connection between art and life, and helps a reader sort of understand what they're seeing in film and television that is often very subtle and identifies trends. Her book about more movies was like that. I think the Going Viral was about that. There's really and Haunted Homes is to really have an understanding of like the meaning of a home and our fears, and how they are manifested in art in a way that reflects sort of what goes on internally with us. Dahlia's a professor. It's the Fashion Institute of New York, correct?
Of technology.
Sorry, fashion. Yeah. Sorry. And I apologize for that. I've known Dahlia for, God, I'm old.
We are both old.
Probably about 28 or 29 years. We went to high school together. We did theater together, not as well as some of the people on this particular call. No Emmy nominations or Oscar nominations, but it's really been fascinating to watch her, sort of take that interest and couple it with her academic pursuits, and write these books. And I would also just recommend to you some of her previous books as well. You may not know she writes fiction, and has written some really awesome, I think, is it 3 fiction books?
I have to count on my my hand.
Okay. As someone who's written some books myself, I can tell you that it's not easy to write one. A lot of people fail in that, and Dahlia just keeps turning them out. I'm amazed at the speed with which she does it. Dahlia, I want to just get you to talk a little bit about this book, and particularly what drew you to this idea of haunted homes, and a little bit about the distinction between a house and a home, and why that matters so much.
I would be delighted. I'll start off actually with the distinction between a house and a home, because that is an important one. And I know when I was figuring out what to call the book and whether to call it Haunted Homes or Haunted Houses, and I wanted to make it very clear that this was not going to be a book about those haunted houses that you have, for Halloween, that you go through with like the eyeballs in a bowl. And the distinction that I realized was that a home is a place where you live, right? Whereas a house is just a structure. And so that's why the book, for instance, doesn't talk about, like, I mentioned The Shining in passing, but I don't talk about The Shining at length, because that's a hotel, that's not a home. So one of the sort of cutoffs or parameters for the book was I'm just looking at places where people live. So not just like a physical structure. What drew me to the topic is kind of like what you were saying in the introduction about how I like to look at or notice patterns in the world around us. And for me, I know, like, when I was doing my PhD, I had one class where I would regularly get into, not a fight because I didn't fight back, but I was getting in trouble a lot with the professor because she said that I wasn't a traditional film scholar because I wasn't starting with the movie. And she was like, if you're a film scholar, you should always start with the movie, and then you kind of, talk about the sort of peripheral issues as secondary. And for me, it's much more about using films and television shows as ways to understand what is happening off screen. So for instance, Going Viral started with the very sort of basic question, which was, when John and I were growing up, we learned about sex at the same time that we learned about AIDS. And so Going Viral started with the query of like, oh, well, that's got to mess with your understanding of intimacy. So how does that work? How does that happen? How is that portrayed in film and television? how are diseases portrayed in film and television, and then that's sort of how that book unfolded. And with this particular book, after the election in 2016, when the world felt like such a dumpster fire, I was incapable of watching romantic comedies, because it was like, everything is on fire, everything is awful. I desperately need something to distract myself, to tone down the anxiety. And so I'd never been into horror movies before, but I started watching horror movies because they were the only thing that would turn the anxiety level down and distract me. So when I'd been in high school, I was kind of a scaredy cat, and I never watched any of the Friday the 13th movies, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween. I was always too skittish. So I started watching those movies. And I just, I watched not all the Amityville movies, because they're like 20, but I watched a bunch of the Amityville movies. And one of the things that stood out to me was, with all these movies, the home is the most dangerous place. And in all those, Friday the 13th, Halloween movies, it's always set in the suburbs, and the suburbs are traditionally what we think of as being the safest place to live. And of all the places that you could be, the home is thought of as being the safest. So what is up with all these movies where the danger always happens inside the home, and you don't breathe a sigh of relief for the characters until they're driving away and the home is in the rearview mirror? So that's the query that initially drew me to this book, and sort of trying to figure out, well, obviously this isn't a fluke. It's not like, oh, one or two movies where you have this premise. It's movie after movie after movie where the scary stuff happens in the home. Oops, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was trying to avoid the atmospherics outside here. So one of the things I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about, and you mentioned the suburbs, is, I think we went through an election cycle in 2020 where there was at least some talk, and certainly a lot of implication about the idea that the suburbs would be abolished, as Donald Trump put it. That essentially there's a huge fear of integration on racial, ethnic, and economic terms. And I'm curious how that plays into, I know, but I think other people might be interested in sort of how that political dynamic plays into this concept of the home as a dangerous place and not a safe place.
I actually, if it's okay, I'll just read the little excerpt from my book where I'm sort of talking about it. So it's at the end of my chapter about race. So one of the things that there were a couple things that were surprising to me when I was working on this book. One of them was that there was initially going to be a chapter about queerness in haunted home narratives. And then I wrote the book and discovered there are zero queer narratives, or zero queer haunted home narratives. And then I did like a podcast while I was working on the book, and someone tweeted at me that there's one haunted home narrative with a queer family. So there is no queer chapter in the book. And then when I was working on this project, I also realized that there are barely any haunted home narratives with Black families. Very, 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 very few. So one of the things that I talk about in this book is how white the suburbs are in real life, and how white the suburbs are in haunted home narratives, and why that might be the case. So this is at the very end of the chapter about race. And I quote these two film scholars who are talking about how films often reflect the way the world has changed as a result of turmoil created by economic crisis, social and cultural change, and political unrest. However, that they're talking about that a lot of the anxiety in these films has to do with spaces resistant to change, namely white middle class environments. They point out that while the fear-provoking figures vary in appearance from film to film, so the source of the fear varies. Sometimes it's demons, sometimes it's the house itself. But the protagonists resemble one another with their white, working to middle class heteronormativity, perhaps consciously or subconsciously responding to fears of a diversifying suburbia. Jonathan Allen, right here, in an analysis for NBC News, explains comments made by Donald Trump in a press conference in July 2020. Trump claimed that his opponent in the upcoming election, Joe Biden, wants to abolish the suburbs. And Allen quotes the Democratic strategist Michael Starr Hopkins, who argues that Trump's message is clear. Elect me and I'll keep Black people out of your neighborhoods and out of your schools. This adherence to a white status quo further reinforces the supposed exclusivity of US suburbs. Racism in the United States has long been loud and public, but racism in the United States has also been quiet and insidious, lurking behind government policy, corporate bureaucracy, and Hollywood's casting choices. While haunted home narratives are not generally considered political statements, perhaps they speak loudly for what is absent, demonstrating the persistent whiteness of US suburbs and US horror films, schemes that were decades in the making.
So Dahlia, the timing of this book is fascinating to me in part because there is this show on Amazon Prime right now. I don't know if you've had a chance to catch it, called Them, about a Black family moving into like 1950s Los Angeles, and into a white neighborhood. And it is a haunted home and a haunted neighborhood in a lot of ways. And it has, I started watching this show and I was like, this is basically what Dahlia is talking about, but from a different perspective than you normally get from Hollywood. Number one, have you seen them? And number two, and what do you think of it if you have? And number two, what do you think is the future in Hollywood for taking these horror stories and haunted home stories in particular, from different perspectives? You mentioned there was only one queer family in one of these movies. What's your take on where this is headed, or if we're seeing perhaps a kind of a unique moment that will pass?
I have not seen Them because I read a review of it that talked about, it was actually a very thoughtful review, that was talking about how kind of at a glance you would think that a show like that would be something worth celebrating, because it is diversity, and there's the show has a Black creator, but the review talks about how the final takeaway from the show is actually very negative, because there's a lot of violence done to the Black body, the physical Black body in the show, and people are hung and raped, and so there's just a lot of kind of sadistic brutality against the Black bodies in that show, and so I have not watched it because I don't really feel up to seeing that. And so I know that like one of the things that I talk about in the book is I talk about the movie The Haunted Mansion, which is the Eddie Murphy movie, the Disney movie. And at a glance, you would think that that would be, what a fantastic example of a haunted house narrative or a haunted home narrative with a Black family. But when you watch it, I actually found it really horrifying, precisely because of the differences between the Haunted Mansion and the Amityville movies, for instance. So one of the kind of the crucial turning points in a lot of haunted home narratives is that the family buys this home. And it's always very, very celebrated that they have bought this home. And usually they've got the home at a bargain because, someone was murdered there or the house has been vacant for a long time. But there's some kind of a bargain, which is what enables this sort of aspirational purchase, right? So they're buying a home that they would not otherwise be able to afford. And then, of course, they're cash poor and then they can't leave when the bad things start to happen. That's, the premise of basically every one of these movies. And in the Haunted Mansion movie, they are not buying, they don't buy the house. They are there. Eddie Murphy's character and his wife are real estate agents who come because the white owner wants to sell. So they are there as employees, basically as staff, not as homeowners. And then at the end of the movie, they are gifted the house. So it's a very, very different premise. And if you watch the movie, I think with sort of 2021 hindsight, you'll see that the Eddie Murphy's wife is treated as property. And it's really sort of kind of demeaning. So I hope that not only do we have more diversity, but that it is more positive diversity. I don't necessarily consider, from what I've read of them, which again, I haven't seen, I don't really consider it to be sort of a positive movie. So yeah, so I hope that we get diversity and that we get positive characters.
Do you think that we're likely to hear more viewpoints? It's one thing to say, this is by a Black creator. It's another thing to have multiple Black creators, multiple queer creators, multiple Hispanic creators. Do you think we're in a moment where this is kind of a unique thing? And I would attach them a little bit to Get Out, although that's not a haunted home in the same way. But I think the question applies to both of them, sort of like, are these kind of one-time shots, or do you think Hollywood's changing permanently in a way that will start to see, 1,000 flowers bloom?
Well, I do think Reese Witherspoon is trying very hard to at least bring more gender parity in Hollywood. I don't know if people were paying attention, but there has been a lot of criticism of the Golden Globes, and there's criticism of the Academy Awards. I don't really know that things are changing. I just know that fewer and fewer people are watching the award ceremony every year. What I will say is that I think that the playing field has changed in that there are more opportunities for people to get work out there. And I think that is a very strong silver lining to, Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, and Blumhouse Productions, for instance. I mean, they churn out movies like a factory. So I don't know that that's necessarily like a good thing, but just because of the sheer quantity, and you've got Blumhouse, making movies for Netflix and not for Netflix, but for Hulu and for Amazon. And there's just so many different platforms that I do think that is going to force Hollywood to change, maybe a little bit. I mean, it becomes sort of a complicated question because the reason why Hollywood just keeps making superhero movie after superhero movie is that most of the money now is being made in foreign markets, and foreign markets like movies that don't have a lot of dialogue and, can have a lot of merchandising, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if the movies that we see in theaters are going to change that much, but I do hope that with all these new streaming platforms and all the new content that is being demanded by these new streaming platforms, that there things will have to open up at least a little bit.
Back to the book.
All right, yes.
No. That's my fault. I wandered you off in another direction. Back to the book. What is the takeaway that you want people to have from this? How is it? I know how it expanded my thinking, but like from your perspective, like what is it that you want people to walk away from, and how do you feel like you lead them up there?
I think the most important takeaway is that I think a lot of people underestimate the power of television and movies. I think they think of it as, real life is over here and then there's entertainment over here. And I think they don't realize how much that entertainment affects the way that they interact with and understand the world. And that is, I get into that in my Going Viral book, which of course was written prior to COVID, but reading Going Viral definitely provided my students with a lot of insight into why things unfolded the way they did with COVID. So hopefully the takeaway is to just sort of realize, how even with something like like horror movies, which I think we tend to think of as being a sort of like disposable, that there's actually a lot of really kind of complex thought that's reinforced, gender stereotypes, racial stereotypes, that kind of thing.
You said before that you hadn't really watched horror movies in the past, and that the pandemic sort of not the pandemic, but what's going on in the election sort of brought this. Yeah. And in our politics sort of brought this on. I think the way that I understood you to mean was you needed something that was even scarier than real life to make real life seem more manageable.
Yes, exactly.
Did you enjoy watching the horror films?
I love them. Now I can't get enough. Like every time, because I've seen so many of them at this point, that every time I find one that's good and that's sort of up my, because I don't like a lot of gore. I can't deal with movies like Saw or Hostel. So anytime I find one that's up my alley, I get really excited.
Do you get creeped out at all while you're writing about this stuff?
Not at all while I'm
late
writing.
At night when you're by yourself and you're writing and you're like, and then, the guy jumps out of the, the corner or the house creaks or whatever. Do you find yourself attenuated to that?
My bedroom now does not have a closet in it, but all my bedrooms prior to now had a closet in them, and I cannot go to sleep with the closet door open.
Wow.
That has always been the case.
One Dahlia fact.
Yeah. And I know the house that we lived in for junior high and high school had a basement. And I always ran up those stairs, convinced that something was going to grab my ankles.
Well, I mean, we went to high school with some, not so great guys. So probably stairs as fast as possible.
No, they were always like demon creatures that were going to grab my ankles. But I know that all of these movies I loved, and I think the only one that really scared me was Hereditary. And after I watched Hereditary, that night I had to sleep with the lights on.
Which chapter of the book did you find yourself loving after not loving it to start with? I always find that there's at least one chapter where I'm like, this is going to be a nightmare, and no pun intended with the haunted homes. But is there a chapter where you like came out of it and you're like, I'm really glad I put
the gender chapter. So there was going to be a gender chapter. Well, it is a gender chapter, but there was going to be a gender chapter and a family chapter, and then the gender chapter and the family chapter ended up getting folded into one, because it was just too confusing what was going to go with gender and what was going to go with family, and there wasn't really a clear distinction. But weaving those together was definitely a nightmare.
I have an audience question I'm going to go ahead and ask, and people feel free to throw questions into the chat if you want to. One of the questions is, I wonder how much of your approach to film and TV in general, watching to figure out what's going on off screen, and even a bit metaphorically, your distinction between a home versus a house, how much of those feel to you rooted in queerness? And the person said, from my point of view, watching to figure out what's going on off screen is really, truly inherently queer.
Wow, there was a lot there. Can you break it down? So just tell me
Yeah.
the first part.
Let me try to, yeah, I'm sorry. Let me break
That's
that
okay.
down. Hold on, sweetheart. I'm sorry. That's
That's
Emma.
okay. I love Emma.
Um, I love Emma too, my daughter. So I think the question is, how much of your film and your approach to film and TV and the
The
subtext,
way of understanding the world.
yeah, and how much of the subtext of what's not actually happening on screen is to you, and including the home versus the house idea, is rooted in queerness.
Oh,
I wonder if I can get the person to send the.
no. I know. But the first part was also asking if it has to do with like trying to understand the world, right? Or is it just how is it rooted in queerness?
How much of your approach to film and TV in general, as you watch what's going on screen versus off screen, and the distinction between a home and a house, how much of your approach is rooted in queerness? Or the person just volunteered to ask out loud if you'd like a clarification.
No. I can try it, and then if they want me to elaborate on anything, then I can. That's actually a really fascinating question that I have never been asked. I think that I have always felt like an outsider. I joke that I feel like I'm an alien a lot of the times because I feel like I am watching things from the outside and sort of trying to understand how people do things almost as if it's like they're speaking a foreign language. And I know that a lot of that probably is connected to queerness because you don't see yourself represented in the world, and that I think so much of our society, as reinforced by Hollywood, is this sort of heteronormative bliss, and like you're supposed to get married and have kids and buy the house with the white picket fence, and there's sort of all these things that you're supposed to do, which I don't want to do. And so I think I'm kind of constantly trying to understand how the world operates around me and why people want to do certain things and are afraid of other things. And it really does feel like I'm like an anthropologist who is, like I've descended upon some, random tribe in Africa that's like, never left this like sort of square mile type of geography, and I'm kind of like trying to figure them out, and they're just sort of doing their thing, and I'm like, that's really weird. And so I feel like that's tied to my outsiderness, and I'm sure, and every queer person can relate to just how exciting it is to see a queer relationship, like a normal queer relationship on TV. And I'm blanking on what it's called, but there's the rom-com holiday movie with Kristen Stewart that came out in December, and it was like really kind of exciting because like there's never a rom-com about a queer couple, but it's awful. It's a terrible movie. And so yeah, so I just feel like I'm an outsider and I don't really understand the world in which I live, and so I try to understand it by parsing these narratives.
One of the things that you do in your books that is unusual is you write books that have academic heft and don't read that way. And I wonder how much that's a function of something that you're unable to explain, or how much that's a function of you really thinking about how to present things that way and how you've developed that skill over time. I mean, you take going viral and the book about private eyes and this book, and I think the one thing that connects them to me, for me as a reader, is this style that's like very much, this is a Dahlia book, like, because books that read like something I want to read are so seldom ones that have that sort of intellectual academic heft, and the ones that have intellectual heft are the ones I don't want to read and kind of have to. You seem to have really been able to mix those things together. So I kind of wonder about your process and developing that. And by the way, I mean, not that you had a lot to go to get better from going viral, but I think that, I've been able to watch an even, sharper honing of that skill. So I'm just curious, like, how you think about that. Is that like God reached down into your brain and was like, here, and you're like, I'm just gonna write, or is this something you think about a lot?
Wouldn't it be great if writing was that easy? I could just sit here and sort of like channel God, and it would just, like, the words would flow out. I feel like every writer can relate to the fact that writing is terrible and miserable. And I am working on a chapter right now, and it is awful, and I hate it. No, my writing approach is absolutely very intentional, and it always amuses me because people are always going to be very delighted that I don't have academic jargon in my book, and they're always like, "Oh, it's so nice. There's no academic jargon," and I always want to know, like, well, why do people want to put in academic jargon? Because everyone seems so happy that I don't have it. And I think I would say I have a very love-hate relationship with academia, but I actually have a very hate-hate relationship with academia. And
Me
what's that?
Me too. It took me 5 years to get through college.
Like, I never wanted to get a PhD. You kind of had to drag me kicking and screaming because I couldn't get a full-time job with just a master's. So I am not interested in writing books for 5 people. I am not interested in writing books that prove how smart I am. I am interested in writing books that my students can understand, and that, hopefully make people think critically about the world around them. And I would like, as many people as possible to be able to understand my books. So it's about, trying to break these concepts down so they are easy to follow. And I think hopefully my students can confirm that I try to do that in the classroom as well, that I try to take complicated ideas and make them understandable, because otherwise, sort of, what's the point? Like, I don't need my students to be like, wow, Dahlia's really smart. I want my students to say, like, oh, that's a really interesting idea.
And they are. I mean, I don't know students, but the ideas are interesting. And I mean, but that's the thing, like, you read through it and you're like, oh my God, there's like a real argument here. And there's like, it has like all the sort of bones of an academic book and doesn't read that way at all. And it's just, it's really
Thank you.
it stands up to that rigor and is enjoyable to read. I've got a question here about whether you have seen His House on Netflix. A South Sudanese couple seeks asylum in England.
Yes, I know it.
Okay, tormented by a sinister force living in their new house. Have you seen it? What do you?
I have not seen it. Should I see it?
All of these haunted homes movies. I don't. You haven't seen it.
I have not seen it. I know of it.
Yes, an emphatic yes in the chat.
Okay.
Good to see it.
Okay.
So, did you have a favorite of these haunted homes?
I think my favorite is Hereditary.
Oh, you.
But I really love the first 2 Conjuring movies, and I've been told by a student who has seen it that the latest Conjuring movie is really good and makes up for the disaster that was The Nun. So I'm excited to see that.
Makes up for the disaster.
Well, no, The Nun was like the third Conjuring movie, and that was awful. And then I guess this is like the fourth Conjuring movie, and apparently it's good.
So it's like the first 3 episodes of Star Wars. The ones that the later made Star Wars are the Nun, and then maybe we're getting into the fourth. We get back to the like characters we like and no animation. um, so the other thing I want to ask you about this book in particular is what's your sort of elevator pitch? I mean, you've got a number of us on this call, and the way that you sell books, and you're not the kind of person to get on the phone and be like, please order 100 of my books. What's your elevator pitch so they can go out and tell their friends about this book and try to get some word of mouth going?
Well, I can confirm that there is no book like this out there, and that haunted home narratives, interestingly, have become more and more prevalent after the real estate collapse in 2008. So obviously there's something going on there, and that they're becoming more and more frequent. And so I think just the bottom line question is, why do we like these movies so much? And then I think the underlying question is, what can we learn from watching these movies? Because I think, again, people think of them as sort of like escapism. And I think what is compelling is how much they do influence not only gender and racial ideas, but also just how messed up the suburbs are. I mean, the suburbs are a uniquely American phenomenon. They were very intentionally constructed after World War II, and there's just so much repressed trauma in the suburbs. And I think that the book exposes that.
Are these movies reinforcing?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify.
Yes. The movies are reinforcing the fact that, like, the suburbs are for white heteronormative people. They're reinforcing the fact that, women are crazy and unstable. It's all those tropes.
I think what's amazing about our understanding of the suburbs, or the public understanding of the suburbs, is that white heteronormative idea. Because what we've seen over the course of time is a diversification of suburbs broadly, but not individual suburbs. They're still very white suburbs, and then you go into major cities, you go into Atlanta, right? Like there are the white suburbs and the black suburbs. In DC, we've got Montgomery County is diverse now, but those inner Montgomery County suburbs are still pretty white. Prince George's County still heavily African American. Like, and it's interesting to me on that reinforcement piece that it perpetuates the concept of the suburb, and a concept that's no longer actually true if you think about suburbs in the sort of literal sense of an area outside the city, but is so very true in terms of how I think we societally conceive of suburbs.
Well, that's why it blew my mind when Donald Trump made it into a talking point during the campaign. Like, I was working on the book when he starts spouting this garbage about how Joe Biden's going to ruin the suburbs. And it's one of those moments where you're like, I can't believe he's saying that out loud. Like, it's just like that in 2021, it's okay to be like, we need to keep Black people out of the suburbs. It's just like, I thought we'd made a little bit more progress in that. I mean, it's bad enough that we had redlining and all this stuff, but it's like, now we got to make the suburbs even whiter.
We got a question. Have you heard of The Watcher in Westfield, New Jersey?
No.
I have not either. So
is that a real thing or a movie?
I don't know, but I thought I would ask it because it was in the chat room.
Yeah. I don't know what it is.
You may need a clarification on what The Watcher is. And Dahlia, what's the next project? Do you know yet? That's my least favorite question as an author.
No, I know. I'm just constantly frustrated that I haven't had time to devote to it properly, because I was hoping that It looks like real creepy letters to owners of a particular house with
Yeah.
threats to kill kids. I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to Google it. Not a movie.
Yeah, no, it's true. Or it's like a story that, I mean, yeah, yeah, you should definitely take a look at that. I read about that.
I feel like I actually, it was like a long form piece in like the Atlantic or something, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I did read it. Yeah, and absolutely fast. I love all that stuff. I find it so interesting because again, it's tapping into something. Like, what is that about? You know, and that's not an isolated case. Um, so the next book is going to deal with memory and sort of and the erosion of memory in contemporary culture and how that's showing up in film and television. What exactly that's going to look like, I don't know yet. But I'm drawn to the fact that it seems like, you know, across the board in all these different age brackets, our memories are getting worse and worse. And just kind of changing our notion of time, you know, history, chronology, this idea that, you know, as a result of like the internet, that, you know, time and space are kind of meaningless. And so I want to get into that, but because I haven't started it yet, I don't have a more articulate description.
At least you're not taking on anything like existential. Um, what's it's hard to put out a book at a time like this. You know, we're coming out of the pandemic now, but it seems we're coming out of the pandemic. You know, knock wood, cross your fingers. Um, what got you through the writing process? You know, it's such a lonely time for so many people, and you knew that when you put this book out, the world wasn't going to be, you know, back to normal. Um, and you weren't going to be able to necessarily like hold a, you know, a Barnes and Noble event, or, you know, enjoy some of the things that that authors tend to enjoy with the release of a book. Not that this Zoom meeting isn't better than that. Just
I eat a lot of carbs when I write. That's how
they're coming onto my body. Thank you.
um I need sugary carbohydrates when I write, because writing is torturous. And then I think I'm kind of like, I think especially when you write academic books that go towards such a small audience, there is always something anticlimactic about when the book comes out into the world. So I think it's a little bit more anticlimactic now because I can't do in-person events, but it's always a little bit weird. You know, that you sort of, and then also there's so much lag time. So it's like, you know, I finished this book months ago. And so it's like, I've kind of been like, oh yeah, I wrote this book. And so it's always kind of weird when it's like, you know, 6 months later or whatever, the book comes out, and then people want you to talk about it, and you kind of have to remind yourself, you know, what you wrote about. So it's always a little bit weird. But one of my favorite parts is when you get to engage in a dialogue, because of course you don't really have one when you're working on it.
I can guarantee to everybody who's on this call that you will learn something on every page of this book.
Wow, thank you.
We did. And I think it's neat that you took a subject that we're, I think, all you know, inherently familiar with, of the haunted home idea. You know, most of us have seen many of the movies. Some of us have seen some of them, or at least have some concept of it, and then tell the reader so much about the genre and about what it means. And I think that's a particular skill and talent. That,
And
you know,
I feel like we also are all very familiar with the suburbs. And I guarantee that you will never see the suburbs the same way again after reading this book. You know, I think there's a lot of sort of innocence that we take for granted that's actually not there. You know, there's a lot of darkness in the suburbs.
that's why I live in the city.
What's that?
That's why I live in the city, because of
Where there's less darkness.
for folks who want to buy your book, Do you have a preferred place that they can go to do it? Where should people buy your book?
They can buy it wherever they want. If they signed up for this event, they should have been emailed a coupon code so they can get the book at, I believe, 30% off if they buy it directly from Rutgers. But it should also be available at local bookstores. Rutgers has a very wide distribution. I think Target can even carry it. So it should be easy to find.
And am I allowed to say Amazon? Can we get it on Amazon?
You can definitely get it on Amazon.
I don't know. Some audiences, that's a a political third rail.
Well, I would like to point out that this event is not sponsored by a bookstore. So I feel like we can say whatever we want.
Ah, I like that. But sponsored by two authors.
Sponsored by two authors.
Two for the price of one.
Yeah. Should we talk a little bit about your book in case people don't know who you are?
I feel like that's an encroachment on your big night. And by the way, Mazel Tov on the release of your book. I'm so thrilled for you and so proud of you.
You're
And
very sweet.
I have
And
an opportunity to say it right now. It's really a big thing that you've done, and you've done it a bunch of times. And never lose sight of the fact that what you did is extremely difficult, and the product is beautiful.
thank you. And John is a fellow author and one of the few people that I talk to when I'm in the miseries of writing, because he understands the isolation and the self-doubt that is sort of a requirement of being an author. And so John recently published a book called Lucky, which goes sort of behind the scenes of the last presidential campaign election. And then before that, you wrote Shattered, which was about the 2016 presidential election. And John is an award-winning political journalist and analyst. So whenever I am utterly confounded by what's happening in Washington, D.C., which happens, I think, daily, I reach out to John and say, what's going on over there?
Just remember, they're about themselves and not about you. Like, you'll be good to go. That's the answer to it all. What's in my best interests is probably the best way to go. So nice of you to mention my books, Dahlia. They are also political third rails sometimes. But I like I was saying before, I encourage everybody to go and buy this. You're going to love it. You will find yourself immersed in it. You'll find, like I said, you'll learn on every page something new. And I don't think we have any more questions from the audience, so maybe we'll let class out a few minutes early.
Sure.
Thank you so much for doing this, Dahlia. It's always fun to talk to you, and
Thank you for doing
I
it.
actually get to see you this time.
I know, it was great.
And thank you to everybody else who came to participate and for your questions and your support of Dahlia.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Night.